Hi, I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. Once again, I'm your host. Please hit our About section. You can check out the t-shirts, right? Represent.com and other vendors. They provide t-shirts, hats, coffee cups, other miscellaneous stuff. Some of the stuff sold out, but kind of keep waiting there. Hats look good, shirts look good. We got long sleeves, short sleeves, gray, black, and the coffee cups are awesome. Dutch Hunter Rendezvous as well. Make sure you catch us. It'll be 4th, 5th, and 6th at the Dawn's Camp. There is a video located in the Chasing Legends section called Dutch Hunter's Rendezvous, which shows you the way in and everything. The event is free to everybody, so just come on out. If you want to just come out Saturday, hang out with us, check out the guest speakers, which will be around dusk, sundown, and all that. If you want to spend the day with us and other activities, that's cool. Great stories and stuff to hear about. But if you want to stay the weekend, come on out Friday night and stay through the weekend. Bring your own food, bring your own water and beverages. There are restrooms there, so we have toilet paper. Extra toilet paper is always appreciated. Don't leave it on the ground. The rats and mice will get to it. But that's being said and done. Also, go out there, check out. You can Google it. You can search it. Legend of the Superstition Mountains, Chasing Legends, Wayne Tuttle. You'll always come down to a bunch of different stuff. But there is Legend of the Superstitions Mountains, and it's .com. Okay, one big word. It's in our About section and in our description there if you drop down that little arrow box. And you can go there to the website, which connects you with all the other stuff we do. So I got all that out of the way. You think that would just be easy, but there's always new people signing up, new subscribers, and you want to always direct them around because there's so much stuff, Instagram, and there's TikTok and all this stuff. Yes, we've joined the TikTok crowd, putting out the little short TikToks now, which is kind of fun because we're trying to always hit a younger audience and get some younger people involved in this. So everything's said and done, and now we're on to the episode, right? So by request, we've got quite a few requests on things, and this is one I'm just going to fulfill. But it seems like one we would have got to. I had to go look down through because we've done a couple hundred of these now. And it's something I've touched upon in other subject matter, but never did full length. And I'm trying to get through because this year at the Treasure Hunter of the Year Awards, there will be, I believe, 30 Veterans Committee people voted into the Treasure Hunter of the Year Awards induction ceremony that will be. Basically, it's the Hall of Fame, and all these people come in. They're people that were not able to receive a plaque and hadn't been around. This is an individual who's on that induction list. Her name was Julia Thomas. Now, Julia Thomas's early years, there's not a lot known. There's just a little bit. It's actually starting to come a little clear. There's a lot of people, because of genealogy, have nothing to do with the Lost Dutchman, nothing to do with the Jacob Waltz or the Superstition Mountains, but because of ties to various families, they go through and they find documents and are able to make connections. We do know Julia was born December 25th in 1862 in Louisiana. But as far as her parentage and so forth, there's been a lot of speculation of who her parents were. A lot of the early authors state that she was born on a plantation. The owner of the plantation was possibly her father, and her mother was a woman named Mammy or something like that. And then we also hear from various authors that she was an octoroon. Jim Bark says she was a colored woman. And it gets curious, but we know her maiden name was either Corn with a C or a K or Kalm. Now that could have been because of her accent, because you have to remember, Julia grew up in a German-speaking household. She spoke German fluently. It may have been her primary language. She's also in Louisiana and then spent some time in Texas, so she probably likely had something of a Southern accent. So who knows how this German-speaking Southern accent really translated and what Corn Kalm might have sounded like, because one of the given spellings is K-A-H-L-N, Kalm. And that's kind of, I believe, what might be on her death certificate. Now, there was some people that did a lot of digging. There was a gentleman named Dietrich Kalm, who was married to a woman named Margaret Manny. And what's interesting with Margaret Manny is these two people emigrated to the United States in 1840. Julia said her parents, one of them was, I think her mother was born in Louisiana, her father was born in Kentucky or Georgia or somewhere. But that was what Albert stated after she passed away. So people are doing great genealogy and stuff, and it starts opening up all these questioning things about Julia growing up in this household, because there seems to be the implication possibly her mother was a slave, but then Julia is referred as an octoroon, which is 1/8 black, which meant her mother would have been only probably half black. And there's a lot going there that her father, and she seems to be well educated. She obviously speaks multiple languages, German and English. She grew up in the household where she spoke German fluently. And she seems somewhat well-to-do. Now, we don't know much about where Julia goes and how she ends up, but she meets a gentleman by the name of Emil Thomas. Emil Thomas has a little bit of a shady early record. Emil's from Germany. He speaks German. And they meet in Texas. Let me get the date here, because I always want to keep the date straight, because Colorado City, Texas, because that's what always messes me up about that. It's Colorado City, but it was in Texas. In 1883, December 1883, they get married. So Julia and Emil get married, and he seems to keep his stuff together after that. So they get married and they begin travel. They both speak German. Emil, even on the early censuses, I think in an 1880 census, he's listed as a baker. A lot of people list him as different things, but Emil always seems to be listing himself as a baker. So that seems to be his trade. As a baker, or he cooked or this type of thing, and worked in that type of industry. So they meet. Emil's sister is married to a gentleman named Alexander Steiniger. He has multiple businesses. He at one time has a saloon and a store and things in Phoenix. They live in Phoenix, so next thing you know is by late 1884, early 1885, Julia and Emil moved to Phoenix because his sister's there, and I'm sure she's saying, hey, you're married, you're getting your life straightened out, why don't you guys come here? We're kind of figuring that's probably what it is. So they move into Phoenix. They get started. And today in a lot of bigger cities, they have the fruit stands, newsstands, things that pop up on the corners. They put, they're kind of their vendors that work on the streets and the corners and stuff. And Emil has a number of these. He has an oyster bar that he has on the downtown Phoenix. He also has several other partners that he runs several things. He starts with, I think it's a soda thing and an ice cream thing. But Julia also has her own business, and let me make sure I get the name right because it's a little bit different. But she had her own place, separate from Emil's, that was listed as the Coffee Stand and Ice Cream Saloon, and it was on Washington. And Washington at the time, downtown Phoenix, was one of the hot streets in the neighborhoods and stuff. So they're building all this up, and they had a number of partners, but suddenly they decide the business must be doing well enough as they're moving from business to business. They've purchased a house down on Jackson Street. It's on the south side of Jackson. It's a nice little house. We believe it might have had some outbuildings. It looks from the old city directories and so forth, and they have borders. But they also now, besides owning property, they invest in having a business. This becomes the business we all talk about. It moves one time, and it sticks around Washington, but it basically becomes a soda fountain, bakery, ice cream parlor, like a confectionery store. And this place opens in 1885. So they're both involved in these businesses. They seem to kind of put it all together. Emil, obviously a baker, obviously teaches Julia a bit of the trade, probably hires a couple people, and everything starts working out. They're doing quite well. So during this process, another family comes into town, and it's a mother and her two sons and daughter, and they're named the Petrasches. Now, Alexander Steiniger comes from Germany. He speaks German. Emil Thomas is from Germany originally. He speaks German. Julia grew up. Well, guess Reinhard Petrasch is German, and he came from Germany, and he speaks fluent German. So it seems to be this great connection of all these people in the mid-18 to late 1880s of all these German-speaking people. And Julia's just part in the mix of all this, and everybody knows her quite well. And the business seems to do very well and thrives. They order a big soda fountain. They made about 18 months on payments till things take a turn, but they seem to be doing quite well with the business. It's quite noted. In fact, years after, towards the end of the business and all, Julia's always remembered as being something of a Phoenix businesswoman, having run it after Emil's gone, which we'll touch upon in a moment. But Julia continues to run the business, and she's known as the woman that ran the ice cream parlor. She appears to always have been very well liked, and people are a bit kind of at a loss later of what happens with her. Now, we have a photograph. We have one single photograph of Julia, and we'll post that up. She looks kind of normal, kind of like a young, pretty woman. She's very, very fair-skinned in the photo. We have to remember also, Julia's Jewish. So she's German, she's also Jewish, and she's a devout Jew. So this also lends in that we don't have someone, and it's puzzling because Julia's hair is kind of curly, but it's kind of like she could pass as just a young Jewish woman. But she's always referred to by Jim Bark as colored. Brownie Holmes obviously claiming to know her, but called her dark as night or pitch black as night, is nowhere near the truth. But there is this problem. In the census records, she's always listed as white. And it's kind of curious. Now, we can say she's an octoroon. We don't know where this really comes from. And as people work genealogy, hopefully we'll find out more and more on this, because even on her death certificate, the check mark is kind of between the box of white and black. And you're kind of like, they didn't check right next to black or white. It's kind of in the middle, so it leaves it open again. She's only referenced as a colored woman, it appears, mostly in the Dutch hunting community and so forth. And how that kind of got stirred, if that's true or not true, it's one of those puzzling things. So I'm hoping that gets itself resolved, because we've always thought of Julia Thomas as black. But it may appear that she may not have been recognized as black, except for someone who may have made that claim and so forth. It's hard to believe Jim Bark, who knew her and met her and frequented the bakery, would mistake her, but by the photograph, it doesn't appear to be a black woman. So everything's going really well, and then suddenly Albert Schaefer, I guess he's probably having an affair, and he decides to take off for California with this woman. And they make a statement in there, it's a white woman. And he takes off with her, but when he leaves, he clears out all the bank money out of their bank accounts, takes all the money from the store, and he takes off and leaves Julia high and dry. And Julia, this is where the Waltz thing and everything comes in, is where obviously Albert probably took care of the books. Julia's sitting down, suddenly realized she's got bills to pay. She's probably got a mortgage. She's got the lease on the building. She's got other things they're doing and payments on certain things. And there's obviously always other things that they have to pay for, flour and other things. And this is where Waltz comes in. But that's where Waltz also makes sense, because Jacob Waltz is a German immigrant who primarily speaks German, and he's older, and most of his friends have probably passed away. So Waltz is probably really comfortable in this position. Now, remember, we have Emil Thomas, who speaks German. He's friends with Steiniger, who probably Waltz knew a number of years, having been one of the first settlers in Phoenix. And then we have Reinhard, Petrash, and Julia, who both speak German. So Waltz is able to go down there, have a bit of a sweet tooth, have some bakery items, a soda or something, and he's able to speak in German with these people that fully understand him. He feels at home. In fact, Julia always refers to him as Grandpa. So she has no family, anybody there. He's German, so it seems like he becomes a bit attached to this small group of people. Now, we don't know how he felt about Emil deserting Julia. We don't really get much reaction from it, and it's always hard to say, because there's a lot of stuff we learn is just like gossip. And a lot of the gossip has become non-existent. There was like all these writings from Frank Alkire that turned out most of it was BS, because nobody could produce where they came from. Nobody could produce anything concerning it that he actually said any of these things. In fact, in his own autobiography, he doesn't talk about Julia or any of that stuff. So it's odd that he had these great like insights on this stuff, but it never made it anywhere else, except someone brought it out of their private collection. And when someone says that, as you know, what do you think I'm lying? Yeah, I saw this. Well, there's a lot of weird stuff like that with people. And one of the things I'd like to say is, well, if you had it and you made a copy, then just produce the copy and show us where it was, and it'll be listed in an inventory. Because even if someone lifted it from somewhere, we'll see on the inventory of list items that was in the box or wherever it came from in a university, we'll know. I know this for a fact. When things go missing, you see something with a line drawn through it, or it's still there, but it's not actually in the box. So people have a tendency through oral tradition and different things to like make up stories. Documentation is usually the dagger, and it comes in the front of them. They always think people are backstabbing them or talking crap about them. No, documentation is the thing that's the basis of the foundation of the truth, and then you got to work the other things around it. If you have a bunch of gossip and stuff about various people, and the documentation proves otherwise, then you have to go back to it and say, okay, there's a problem here. Anyways, Waltz comes into the picture. He's trying to help Julia out because Julia obviously is kind of spinning her wheels there. In fact, right after Albert leaves, because he leaves sometime early in 1890, by May, Reinhardt owns most everything in the store, all the equipment, anything material. He's not taking over the lease, but Julia signs everything into Reinhardt's name, and this is obviously a ploy of Reinhardt has some money. He lends the money to Julia to help to pay on some bills, and Reinhardt himself, now everything is due to him for back wages, supposedly. This means Julia, if the creditors or someone comes in, they can't seize her personal property. Reinhardt owns it. So she's trying to protect herself at this time. And this is when Waltz comes in. Now, a lot of people have a question of, when this is all taking place, why was it so long? Because it was December 25th of 1891 when Waltz tells them this stuff. But Julia and Reinhardt make a point, both of them, that when Waltz helped pay the bills and all this stuff is resolved, it took a period of time. They spread it out. And once things were resolved, Waltz didn't talk about it. And they didn't know where the money came from or the gold and how this all worked out. But they just decided he was their friend. They're not going to cause a problem with this. And they just let it be. It wasn't until December 25th, 1891, which is a couple months after Julia's divorce was finalized, that Waltz might have felt secure in telling her something. Because imagine an email come back in and now the email's part of the partnership. So at this point, everything's rolling right, and then the flood comes, and then Waltz passes away. Now, during this period, most of the time, Waltz spent at Julia's place. The obituary basically says he died at Julia's house. Now, there's always these discrepancies in this because of the Holmes thing. And Dick Holmes' story in the newspapers from himself has Waltz dying at Julia's house, at a store, at the back of the store, in a shed behind the store. And the problem is Julia's place business and the leases we're able to document because there's actual documents in the recorder's office. And if you look at her history, she wasn't in any place that there doesn't seem to be in the fire, whatever you call them, the engineered plans. The building she's in doesn't seem to have this back room that they could have put him in. He probably was at Julia's house the whole time. But giving that neither here nor there, Julia cares for him. She's the one that sends Reinhardt to look for him. Reinhardt brings him back over. They take him to the doctor. He goes back to Julia's house because there's not much they can do with him. And he lasts for the next 8 months. And it appears he gets better and worse, and it just drifts and it goes on until Waltz dies. And it's probably a combination of probably pneumonia, just not his immune system, and being elderly, because let's face it, Waltz was up there in age. He'd probably outlived most of his friends, if not all his friends. So all this takes place, and that's when Julia basically takes her time to sell the store. Waltz dies in October. She has to get everything done. They continue to work the store. She gets out of the store. She gets all of her leases taken care of and everything. She does good business. Once she resolves everything, then they get some other things and pull some things together. Now you have to remember, somebody was recently inquiring and mentioning Jacob Waltz having a will. Waltz didn't need a will because the Starr brothers had basically his will. His property, most everything he had, the horses, everything went to the Starr brothers. Jacob Waltz's will was with the Starr brothers because that's who he made it to and left everything to. Julia Thomas ended up with personal things that he had at the time, some papers and little things he brought from the house that were salvaged, and then later he had Reinhardt dig under the hearth and recover some ore that he had buried. So that was, the Starr brothers had no idea there was a mine or any of that stuff existed, and afterwards there was only one Starr brother left, and he might have been a little irked about that, but there was nothing ever said. There's also another thing about the court cases over the ore and stuff. There's no sign of these court cases, no documentation. If someone brings it up, they probably created it at this point because everyone's hounded and went through it. So the documentation kind of runs a little thin after that. We know Herman and Gottfried and Reinhardt go out with Julia. They make several trips. They're out by Weaver's Needle. They're actually in Needles Canyon, kind of the just north of Weaver's Needle and Bluff Springs Mountain. They have a number of difficulties. Ironically enough, they walk over what's today known as the Mammoth on the way in. So they walked right through millions of dollars worth of gold on their way into the mountains. But they're pointed and they follow the directions the best they can. Herman and Gottfried make a couple trips into the mountains, exploring around, because P.C. Bicknell's writing articles, and P.C. Bicknell's also a big thing he's after is the Two Soldiers Mine. And those two things start becoming erupted because the Two Soldier Mine's well known. Waltz's mine is very little known. The newspaper articles written on it get his name wrong, get Julia wrong. They call her a negress. They say he's the housekeeper. She was the nursemaid. She worked for Waltz, all these other things. And the problem is, anybody that would have been even vaguely local would have known she was the businesswoman that ran her own store, and she took Waltz in and cared for him. So we have all this stuff that's problematic. It's the outsiders trying to tell the story without having any real information. And this is where things tip out of Julia's favor. For a year or two, they search, and then everything kind of drops. The Petrashas run around, they prospect. Everybody's got to make a living, remember. They can't just spend all their time in the mountains searching. It appears the Petrashas off and on search the Superstitions and go out and do some other money. Reinhardt actually spends a lot of time with his dad and his brother, moving around different places around in Arizona, and in Maricopa County for one, and then up into Yavapai County doing stuff. So Reinhardt, again, another thing later on, as people always say, well, what was he doing? He knew nothing about mining, prospecting. He was obviously learning from his dad, brother, and other people, because he spent years after this, after Waltz's death, and whatever he learned from Waltz. So he had to have some clue. But Julia, on the other hand, is kind of sitting around, and this gentleman, Albert Schaefer, who was a hay baler and worked locally in town, suddenly make some advances, or somehow they get along, and they suddenly end up together, and they end up getting married in 1893. Now, this is basically a year or so, within the year or so after Waltz dies. Schaefer actually does go out and search in the mountains with the Petrashas, and he searches in other areas. So there's an attachment. They're all still kind of in good with each other for the first couple of years, and then everything starts to break down. But that's what we kind of get. Now, we have, obviously, census records and things after that, but Julia seems to go very quiet. Now, we know that her and Albert, with another partner, file a claim on the western end of the Superstitions and everything. But then the odd thing is, getting to the end of the turn of the century here, getting closer to 1900, something happens. Someone probably drifted through town, or something came through town, and Julia starts having visions. And Julia now, everything about her personality is dropped, and even these things that would follow become precursors to the story, which they shouldn't have been, because you've probably heard of Julia and the powders and the voodoo and all this stuff in Waltz, and she did horoscopes. Forget about all that stuff. Sometime in the late 1890s, her and Albert get into this whole thing of that whole apocalyptic kind of like, things going to happen, we got to save people, the end of the world's coming, and all this, and they start doing all that stuff. It happened in 1800, happened in 1900, happened in 2000. Well, this is all happening, and for some unknown reason, due to their backgrounds, they both speak fluent German, but Julia is Jewish, now is the prophetess. She's having visions and stuff, and everybody's listening to her, and Albert's quite taken with it. He becomes the white Messiah. He's Roman Catholic, so we can kind of see a little of this whole deity, maybe that kind of like some dogma coming out of that. But they go this whole Christian route, which both of them are not just this kind of newfangled Christianity. He's Roman Catholic, she's Jewish, but they depart. Albert starts to growing his beard out, and he has white robes. He rides around on a bicycle around town, and he preaches about the end of the world and all this type of stuff and all this. So they start a group at the house, and this group seems to be something about the end of the days, end of the world type thing, and a number of people, because this becomes a very almost fashionable thing, people gather in. There's newspaper articles about people and stuff. There's a court case. There's transcripts from the court cases. Julia was on the stand. And Julia, some of the stuff, when people are saying they're messiahs and stuff, Julia, they even note Julia's rolling her eyes up there like, yeah, they're talking crazy. It's hard to say how crazy it was, because you have the crazy people that seem to buy into it. Albert seems to be a little unhinged, standing on the roof, prophesizing and all this. But oddly enough, everyone that meets with Julia, the Howlands met with her, Simsili did, Bark, and all the people in the early turn of the century 1900s seem to find her very calm, very nice, and she sits there and talks to them, and she's very kind of point on, still knows what she's talking about, doesn't change the story and everything. We don't know anything about her selling maps because no one's ever produced a Julia Thomas map. People have produced fake maps because they always put that one with the horse's head and all that stuff on it. That was created by the author Orrin Arnold for his book. It says facsimile of a Julia Thomas map. I tried to track it down because Travis Tomlinson also had an original Julia Thomas map on leather. And then I found, well, how can it be an original when she didn't even make that one? That was one someone made up by the clues. So we don't know anything about her selling the maps because I've heard she sold them for $10 a piece, $100 a piece, $1,000. Imagine money she was making if she sold 10 maps for $1,000 a piece. Julia was raking it in. But things don't go well. Actually, the whole thing of the fervor after 1900 for a while, the whole thing about the religion dies down. There's some court cases, but it's nothing really against them shutting down. It's people throwing stuff out. They usually attack Albert more. Julia doesn't really seem to get hit very hard by any of it. But she seems to be a very nice lady. Most everybody that talks about it, did interviews with her, say she was very nice. But at the end, Simsili and some of them meet with her and say things were not going well. And part of this is she became very ill. She developed a thing called Bright's disease. And it caused a lot of swelling and a lot of problems with her. And her health deteriorates more. But if you still read these interviews and these people that met with her, she seems like a very nice lady. She was very calm, talked to them, was more than happy to talk about Waltz and the Dutchman and stuff. The problem is, unlike most of us today, would have a lot of personal questions about Waltz and things he said. And background stuff, those people didn't care because they just want clues to the mine. So Julia at the end is just kind of like that. She passes away from Bright's disease. Albert's pretty shaken up. He sells the property shortly thereafter, has her buried at the Jewish cemetery here in Phoenix. Why? Because she's Jewish. Why wasn't Albert buried there when he died? Albert wasn't Jewish. The Jewish people are buried in the Jewish cemetery. We don't know where her grave is. There are several people that have put in like they know and they've said things. It's BS. Her grave may have been marked at one time, but the marker's long, long gone, and it couldn't have been anything real permanent. There's probably about 20 unmarked graves that we don't know who was in there. There's about 15 people we know are buried there, including Julia, that we don't know where they're buried at. During those times, there was some flooding. Some of the records were destroyed and all that. So I've been down. I have a complete set of everything possible from the Jewish cemetery. I've done ground penetrating radar and everything. So I have the whole, as piece by piece it goes, we narrow it down. It was the possibility of like 1 in 45. I've got it down to about 15, 20 grave sites. And she's not buried next to Paul Schaefer. Give that up. Name spelt differently, has nothing to do with Albert Schaefer. Anyways, Julia's buried. And by the time that happens, everything goes out because now she's the voodoo lady. She's black as night. She's all these things. Everybody knew her. She was a crazy woman. She was doing powders in the street and did this stuff and light up the houses and stuff. Most of that stuff happened after 1900 because they had a big kiln furnace out in front of the house. Now, what's odd is one of the places she goes to is down in Sacaton and stirs up some trouble there because she's telling all the people, all the Pimas, don't need to work and stuff. The end of the world's come and join us. Well, they quit working and everything starts going to hell. And it's because this woman. Now, there's 2 Julia Thomases, but we believe it's her. And she's down there. And the thing in the papers are, nobody can believe it could be the Julia Thomas who ran the ice cream place because she was such a nice lady, just a wonderful person. She was successful. What happened? So we figure it's probably her, but it's very odd. And if you look back in Phoenix, some of those directories after the turn of the century, early 1900s and the 1920s, 30s, they would compile these lists of people, prominent members and stuff. She was considered one of the most prominent women in Phoenix because not only did they consider her a minority, some did, but mainly she was a woman that ran her own business at one point, and it was a big deal. Now, she had to be very well liked because the business was very successful, and people said, what happened with her? Waltz seemed to care about her and like her very much. Reinhard Petrasch never says anything bad about her, neither does Herman. They felt she was a bit of fish out of the water going into the mountains and so forth. There is the story where she went back in the mountains and they got separated for a bit. She got up on a rock and the rattleweeds out there in the wind during sundown were going off, and she had a little gun. She was shooting at the rattleweeds thinking they were snakes after her. And she got a lot of cactus, but she wasn't really suited. But she still toughed it out and did it, and she made other trips later with Albert. Now, the last thing we really want to talk about is the whole thing about their religious cult out in Morristown. Albert and a guy named John Beggs went out there. They filed some claims. They dug around. They had a little spot there. I've been to the cabin. I documented. You can find footage of that cabin here because I actually went there, found the grave sites. That wasn't a cult or anything. It was two old prospectors, one man who called himself a minister and farmer, Albert, and then he buried his friend John Beggs, and then later Albert died. Albert believed you didn't get buried for 3 days after he died, and it's in his will, and he felt the same with Julia because he felt they might be resurrected, and just in case he was going to be resurrected, he didn't want to dig out of the dirt. So he asked that they be kept above ground for 3 days. I don't think he was, though. And he didn't come out because I didn't see anything like he crawled out of there. So I don't think Albert resurrected from the grave. But it's a very interesting story with Julia because she was a successful businesswoman. We don't know how hard of a early life she might have had. It sounds like she might have grown up with a good family, a good education, and so forth and all that. A lot of the people around her seemed to think well of her. I found it's mainly the Dutch hunting community that kind of besmirched her a bit as time went on, that she was a ranting and raving lunatic. Even the people concerning the church thing, most of the focus seems to always be the stories on Albert. Julia seems to be the prophetess. She had visions. She spoke of things. But Julia might have been quite cunning, quite articulate, intelligent to do that and sit in the background. I hope I get the whole transcript of the court cases. I got it somewhere sitting in a file folder. But it's very interesting because hearing from Julia on the stand and the reporters thing and all, it's interesting to look at because you realize this is an articulate, intelligent woman, could speak multiple languages, had been a successful business owner, and yet Julia Thomas is always thought as the crazy black woman that when Waltz died couldn't, she obviously cared for him. She didn't attend the funeral. It was because she was so distraught. He was like a grandfather to her. So we should always kind of remember these people in more respectful terms. Her, Herman, Petrasch, Reinhardt, Gottfried. A lot of what these people went through because of the obsession, some of the passion. Julia's obsession, passion with the Dutchman and the waltz and that thing seemed to fade, but something else happened later, and it possibly could have been Albert Schaefer, and she could have realized a good thing. I can sit home, I don't have to work, people bring us money and food. Wow, this is cool. Who knows how that went? We'll find out more, because as time goes, people are going to pull out more documents, more information, and this stuff will build out. And the people that want to tell the lies or be deceptive or go out there and post things that are not true, that stuff will fade away because documentation will always hold through. Now, I want to thank two people who did a great job on this stuff early on in the documentation and worked with me because I was working my own end, and then we pooled our stuff together and we built quite a history, because I could sit here and talk for 3.5 hours about the documents and things of Julia Thomas, her burial and all kinds of stuff, and the property ownership. But Gary Cundiff and Larry Hanna, those two guys did a great job. They weren't here in Phoenix, and they would go out and they would just pull documentation and file for papers and look for stuff. And they had an uncanny knack of getting documents and surveys and all kinds of engineering papers. And when I worked on things, they would coordinate. We'd talk on the phone and email, and I always want to give those two guys credit because they did an awesome job. And there's people that said, oh, you're trying to besmirch my character and this and that. No, Gary and Larry just basically owned your butt on research because they did impeccable work. I could not find problems with their work. They were very honest, and they shared all the time. And I don't know where they always are anymore. I don't know their health or how they're doing. I don't know if they watch this stuff and they remember that. But I always appreciated that because those two guys were awesome researchers. So there you go, Julia Thomas. Someday we'll have even more. We'll be able to do another one of these with more expansive stuff. But for right now, anybody can find documentation. We got the census records that say she's white. We got people in the Dutchman community say she's black or colored. And we kind of end up in a weird puzzling thing of like, we find her family history. We could find out one way or the other, right? And it would be interesting to know. Because it is interesting when there's a tale and you find out something completely different about someone. But anyways, thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it this week, because we can get in more in depth in these profiles of these Dutch hunters and put stuff out there so you guys can do some more work on it. You guys can dig around and find your own thing. All right. That being said and done, check us out. Hit subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you know next one's up. We'll see you this Friday, probably with another live. We'll hopefully try to get another special guest in there. We had a great time with Woodrow Wilson Wampler this last week. We'll keep getting better at that and bring some other people in. But until the next time, everyone take care. And remember, I'm Wayne Tuttle, you're not, and this was Chasing Legends.